Hare Krishna, thank you all for your wonderful, deep engagement in this practice. We do feel our hearts uplifted and filled with joy, with love, and according to the yoga tradition, this is the natural joy and love of the self. So, as you mentioned earlier, you were interested in going somewhere where it's not about drinking and putting other things in order to try to be happy, because it's in the yoga tradition, it's the other way. We release it, open it up, access that natural joy, happiness, love, compassion that is there. That is our own nature. Okay, do you have any questions or thoughts or reflections?
I think you already told us, but
Yeah.
what are those words mean?
I didn't tell you.
Oh.
I said it's something that we could discuss. And so that's a wonderful place to begin. Thank you. What's your name again?
Amen.
And from the Netherlands. Yeah, good. What do these words mean? There are, like all words, there are many meanings. We will explore some, right? So Hare is an address to the feminine divine, and Krishna and Rama, they both address the masculine aspect of the divine. They're very beautiful references of ways of addressing. So Hare to the feminine divine invokes that caring, nurturing, compassion and love upon us. And Krishna, this is a name that means unlimitedly attractive. So someone might tell you, you're a handsome young man. Have people told you that before?
Maybe.
Yeah. That's a very diplomatic response. If they haven't, they should have.
Let's try to be humble. I had a profound experience. I have Crohn's disease, and I was in so much pain I didn't think I could get here. So I sent the chant here.
Okay, yep.
And the pain broke up and it spread. My whole body was in pain for a while, but I just let it go. And I just feel my whole body full of light right now.
Oh, wonderful.
Very, very healing.
Thank you for sharing that. Such a profound, tangible experience.
No, I can really see how this is a very healing physically.
Right.
And on many levels.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that you were able to release the pain.
In part.
Yeah.
But the pain was moving. It was
Right.
flowing. It
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah, yeah.
stuck anymore.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, and we'll all experience it differently as well, according to our need and our relationship with the divine at the time. Thanks. So the name Krishna means unlimitedly attractive. So we gave one example of what that might be. It might be beauty. We have some quality of beauty that attracts us to one another, but it's limited. What about unlimited beauty? Unlimited beauty, that's the divine. And we reflect that to different levels. And then another quality of this all attractiveness is wisdom. We have some wisdom, but then what about the source of infinite wisdom? That's the divine. Another quality of attraction described in the yoga text is strength, courage, strength. What about unlimited strength? And then another is detachment as well. that humility, that detachment, that's another quality. So unlimited. So these are described as the qualities, some of the qualities of the divine, the source. And so when we invoke this name, Krishna, it's a very beautiful name, and it connects us with the all-attractive source. And we all seek the all-attractive. We seek the attractive in one another. We are attracted to wisdom and strength and beauty and courage. And so the yoga texts explain, Aristotle made the same argument. We are searching, Socrates made the same argument. We are searching. The soul is longing for that connection with the divine. And so the sacred sound is an easily accessible way of connecting with that supreme source. And so that's the name Krishna. That's the meditation that is invoked there. And then Rama means the source of all joy, or the reservoir of all happiness. So Hare, Krishna and Rama, these are the names that we sing in that Maha Mantra, or the great chant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And like I said, there are many ways of understanding and meditating on these names, and there have been dozens and dozens of commentaries written within the tradition over hundreds of years. But that's a very brief explanation. Thank you. Any other question, thought? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm curious about in this practice when you might have a thought, like I started to feel like I was going to get the giggles, and I was like, oh no giggles, I need to be like focused.
Okay.
And if it's like the idea is to kind of invite whatever comes up and be with that thing, or maybe meditate on what these words mean, or something else.
Yeah, good questions. And so Chaitanya, whom I told you about earlier, so 500 years ago, Chaitanya is this personality who led a spiritual revolution in India. He felt that spirituality had become very ritualized and dogmatized and monopolized by a priestly community, and very far away from the spirituality that it's supposed to represent. And so he encouraged people to come out together in community like we are now, and just invoke the divine with this kirtan practice. Primarily kirtan. It was bhakti broadly, but we can talk more about bhakti, but primarily he emphasized the kirtan. And it is described how when he would sing kirtan, he would laugh, he would cry, he would dance, his hair would stand on end. And maybe we felt some of that, hair standing on end, or tears, or laughing. Yeah. So I saw some tears. I felt the hair standing on end myself, and then you're telling us that you felt the laughing, joy. And so all of that is natural, and it's described in the Bhakti text as a natural awakening that happens through this practice. Yeah, beautiful. So the biography, Chaitanya's biography, describes how the day after he received this chant from his teacher, he went back to his teacher and said, "What did you give me? When I chant this mantra, I cry, and then I laugh, and then I dance." And the teacher said, "Very good. The mantra is having its effect. You just carry on." And then later on, he was challenged by some monks who are very much about austerity and monastic practice. And they said to him, "You're a monk, why don't you be more sober and study the sacred texts for many hours a day and be in your silent meditation?" What? And Chaitanya said, "My teacher gave me this mantra, and I told him when I chant it makes me dance and cry, And he said that that's the path, and so that's what I do. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or reflections? So I told you that this kirtan, it's part of the broader bhakti yoga tradition, and we spoke a little bit about that earlier. I said bhakti means love and yoga means to connect, and we spoke about connecting with the body and the breath and the mind and the self and the supreme self, and then the supreme self present within all beings. So these many levels of connection that take place. So bhakti yoga is the primary teaching of a text called the Bhagavad Gita. Who's heard of the Bhagavad Gita? Yeah, most of our hands have gone up here. So this is a text written in Sanskrit, set within the tradition. The claim is that it was spoken 5,000 years ago. So a very ancient text. Within academia there are various theories and attempts to date the text, and they all contradict one another. So I'll just sit with the tradition, which says around 5,000 years. Although when you read the Bhagavad Gita itself, it says that this knowledge is timeless. It was received, according to the Gita's own claim, millions of years ago, and it is passed down in a chain of teachers and disciples, a disciplic succession of teachers and students. So the primary teaching of the Bhagavad Gita is Bhakti Yoga, this loving connection. And so we spoke a little bit about that. But let me give you the context of how the Bhagavad Gita is spoken. Some of you may be surprised, and often people who read the Bhagavad Gita are initially, they're a little unsettled by the fact that this sacred text is spoken in the most profane and disturbing of contexts, and that is a battlefield. So a site of the worst of human nature, our worst quality, when we become driven by aggression and violence, and then when we do that communally, not even one-on-one now, it's two opposing camps come together. And so that was the context for the Bhagavad Gita to be spoken. And sometimes people are troubled by this. This is a sacred text. We would expect it to have been spoken in a monastery somewhere, in the Himalayan mountains, by a wise teacher to their very disciplined student. And yet we have it appearing on a battlefield context. But this is in fact most, this is in fact a powerful message for all of us, because Arjuna, he's the protagonist of the Bhagavad Gita. He's a prince and he's a warrior, and he sees the soldiers before him, and he's full of bravado initially, but then he sees that it's a fratricidal war. That means it's a tension or a conflict between the same family. So the family's been divided, and these are the family of basically those who are the emperors in India. So vascular kings ruled under them. So all the kings of the known world of that time have taken sides. They're all lined up, facing off against each other. Arjuna goes out to the center of the battlefield, full of bravado and courage, and then he sees uncle, grandfather, cousins, all lined up on the opposing side. And he says, what are we doing here? What are we about to do? I don't need a kingdom. I don't need to enjoy the opulences of the earth as a great ruler. if it will be tainted with blood, the blood of my own kinsman? And he says to his friend, mentor, guide, who has taken the role of his chariot driver out of love. He's a great ruler himself, but he's taken the role of a chariot driver out of love for Arjuna. I will drive your chariot for you during this battle. That's Krishna. And he says to Krishna, what are we doing here? Let me go from this battlefield. Let me become, essentially he says, let me become a monk. Find me an ashram somewhere in a forest and let me get as far away from this materiality as possible. I'm out. Let my cousins have the kingdom. I don't care. Right? Yeah. So we would think, okay, this is a sacred text. It's a yoga text. We would expect maybe that Krishna, he would say to Arjuna, bravo, Arjuna. You have now finally come to spiritual awakening and insight. You are ready to renounce materialism and renounce attachment to the world. Bravo, finally. Yes, go to your ashram. Be a monk and achieve enlightenment. That's what we would expect of a sacred text, right? But it's not what Krishna says. He surprises us. And he surprises Arjuna. He says, Arjuna, how has this petty weakness of heart come upon you? It is not befitting a person of your character to run away from a battlefield. Arjuna says, but no, it's material. Let me out of this. And Krishna says, Arjuna, you have your nature. You have your propensity. And that is, you are a warrior. You are a prince. That's your conditioned nature. We all have a conditioned nature. We all have strengths. We have challenges, limitations. So yes, at Arjuna's essence, he is a spiritual being, a soul, an Atman, free of material designations. But in that particular context, he was still an attached warrior. Okay, momentarily he's had this great detachment. He's had this great awakening. But is it sustainable? That's the question. And Krishna's sense is that it's not. In his moment of existential crisis, he's ready to give it all up and run away. But Krishna, he knows Arjuna, and he says, Arjuna, living as a monk in a forest, that's just not who you are. Maybe at some point, at some stage in life, but you've been swept up in the moment here. And you have a duty. You have a duty to your citizens. You have a duty to your family. You have a duty to society to defend virtue. Arjuna's that represents the side of virtue, and then his cousins are, we can say, usurpers. They've used all kinds of conniving and trickery and deviousness to try to usurp control of the kingdom, and that's what's brought it to this moment. So Arjuna's ready to give in. Oh, let them have it. But is that responsible for him to do? Is that the virtuous choice in that moment to hand the kingdom over and all the citizens and their well-being over to unqualified rulers who are driven by greed and selfishness and envy? They tried to assassinate Arjuna and his brothers different times as well. He's ready to hand it over to them. Yeah, have the keys to the kingdom. I'm off to the forest. So Krishna doesn't encourage him. And this is telling for all of us, each and every one of us, who have an interest in spirituality and want to cultivate a spiritual practice. And we might think, if only I could go to Tibet or Nepal or Bhutan, and I could be so spiritual there, and I could wake up in a mountaintop monastery, and I would see the waterfalls over the valley, and there would be rainbows, and I would be so spiritual. Right? Do you think like that sometimes?
Nice.
Yeah, that's right. Krishna's challenge to Arjuna was, Arjuna, you be spiritual here, on this battlefield. And Arjuna, he's really confused by that. Krishna, the battlefield is ghastly. A battlefield is, how do you do spirituality here? What's about to happen here is not spiritual. But that's Krishna's challenge. No, Arjuna, you bring your spirituality to here, to this battlefield. And so that's the dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita, how to do that. How to be a spiritual being in a material world or a material context. Because we are spiritual beings. We're in this material context, and we think sometimes I'll escape it by going somewhere that we think of as being spiritual. But if we take our material consciousness there, to that hilltop monastery in Tibet somewhere, if we take our own material consciousness there, then even though we may be in the hilltop monastery, gradually, slowly, we'll slip away from that spirituality and we'll be back to where we are. We cannot escape ourselves. And so it's about changing our own heart rather than leaving it all up to changing the environment. So that's Arjuna's challenge. How to be spiritual on the battlefield. And if Arjuna is told, you have no excuse here, Arjuna, you can do this, be spiritual on the battlefield, it means we also have no excuse. We can be spiritual in Boston. We can be spiritual in New York. We can be spiritual in Los Angeles. We can be spiritual. I'm from Sydney, Australia. That's our challenge. If Arjuna doesn't have excuses for not bringing or cultivating spiritual consciousness in what he does on a battlefield, then we definitely have no excuse. Okay, yes, it's not the Bhutan mountaintop. It's Boston, but it's not nearly as challenging as a battlefield. People firing arrows at you in those days, or coming at you with swords and so forth. We have a relatively peaceful environment. You know, sometimes it might feel we're being fired with arrows in the workplace context, maybe. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then. And by the way, if you have comments or reflections or questions, feel free to share, chime in. So, how is Arjuna to bring this spirituality to the battlefield? Now, one thing is this problem of karma. Karma's a, yeah.
Toilet is there, right?
That is, yes. Okay.
Left or right?
No, left. I thought you were going to offer some cutting spiritual insight. But yeah, there are pressing human needs as well.
I actually do have a question. I'm
Please.
curious. There's like a definition of what spirituality is, and right now that like escapes you what the dictionary definition might be, and I'm curious what it might mean in the context of these traditions, or to you, or if it's an individual thing. And
Yeah.
that's
I'm sure it is individual at some level as well, and I'm sure there's a definition. Certainly there is a dictionary definition. So I'll give you a Bhagavad Gita response, because I'm sitting here to represent that and to share that with you. So rather than try to make something up, or I'll just go straight to the source there. And so what the Bhagavad Gita does so wonderfully is distinguish between spiritual and material. And generally this is something pretty flaky and abstract. And what does it mean to be spiritual? So we do have many different definitions, and what we're left with in a secular society often is spiritual means that which elates, so gives us a sense of something, the sublime, so poetry, literature, art, it gives us a sense of awakening there and elation. The Bhagavad Gita will approach this question by discerning the spiritual nature and the material nature. Spiritual is consciousness. It has qualities of eternity, self-awareness, joyfulness, love, and matter, on the other hand, is unconscious. It is not self-aware. It is temporary, so constantly changing. And so this instrument, this floor, these are all, and the body, by the way, they are all comprised of matter. And then consciousness, the self, who we are, that's the spirit. And so, it's quite clear when we look at it from that perspective in the Bhagavad Gita. And so the body is only animate and aware so long as the self is present. And then when the self leaves, we say, she has gone. He has passed away. It's the same body, but something has changed. The same hair, the same eyes, the same lips, the same skin, the same flesh, bone, marrow. All the physical, material components of the body are still there initially, but something has changed. And that is according to the tradition, or the yoga tradition, that is the Atman, or the self, has left. And therefore the body is no longer conscious. So then let's talk about spiritual life. Spiritual life cultivates awareness of that spiritual nature and connects with the self and the supreme self. So the supreme source. In America, you guys are much more comfortable saying God. In Australia, I dance around that word, and I say supreme source, supreme self, because the word comes with a lot of baggage as well, based on people's own earlier life experiences, which may not have been positive, but I have noticed that when I speak to people in America, there's a lot more comfort with the G word. But in Australia, that's not the case. So there's some clear distinctions there. Eternity, knowledge, and bliss versus unconscious, temporary, without feeling, without self-awareness or reflection. But then we can bring spiritual consciousness into everything we do. As we cultivate awareness of our spiritual nature and the Supreme Source, then we can bring that consciousness into the music, into the discussion, into the food, and it becomes spiritualized. So, paper and ink, it's matter, it's material. But then if it's discussing self-realization, then it's a spiritual text. And the paper and ink takes a spiritual dimension. So this idea that everything we interact with can be made spiritual. And now let's go back to Arjuna on the battlefield and what he has to do. He could be acting, he could be fighting, engaged in this war, driven purely by ego, hatred, envy. So this is the material conditioning that covers the soul, that gives rise to the greed and the envy and the anger and the pride. Or Arjuna can be engaged in that activity as a sense of, out of virtue, as a sense of dharma or duty. He has a duty, he's a ruler, he has a duty to protect, he has a duty to ensure that there is stability and rule of law on the land. That's his duty. It's not necessarily yours or mine, but that's his duty. And so his fighting a profane, generally deeply material thing, he can bring spiritual consciousness to what he does. And that's what Krishna tells him in the Bhagavad Gita. Engage in your duty, but do so as an act of service. Do it as an act even of loving service. Firing those arrows, and that's not what we advocate. I'm a pacifist. But as a contrast, that's the extreme example. And once again, the extreme example is given to us that if Arjuna can do it within that extreme context, then we should be able to do it going to school, or going to work, or serving our family, or our community, our home, everything that we do. So the Gita says beautifully, Yat kadoshi, yat ajnasi, yat juhosi, dadasi yat tapasyasi konteya, tad kurusha madarpanam. Did you get that? No. You work on it. So whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer, whatever you give away, do that as an offering of loving service. So, yeah, that's yoga off the mat. We sit on the mat, we engage in some asana, and if we are able to connect and go deep, connect, give some direction to the mind, connect with the self and the Supreme Self through a meditation practice. But the real meditation is when we can take it onto the street, take it into our workplace, take it into our homes, take it into our relationships, such that everything we do becomes a spiritual act of loving service, of bhakti yoga, bringing us closer to, connecting us with the divine. There's another one of those dance phrases that I use, the divine.
I'm trying to understand how we can oppose another person and come from the spiritual. A person, a political party, whatever it might be, all that comes to mind is honoring the divine in them at the same time.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. But think of Gandhi. I mean, he advocated non-violence, but he was very oppositional as well. So he had a sense that, and it comes from the yoga text, Satyam eva jayate, truth will always prevail. He had a sense, he was so convinced of his being on the side of virtue and truth and standing up for the oppressed and giving them a voice. And so he was so deeply convinced of that, like a Martin Luther King who took inspiration from Gandhi, that they could be oppositional, but they could also be respectful at the same time. Oppositional, and yet at the same time having a deep love
In graduate school, I did a study on responsiveness to assertiveness. And what was fascinating about it is if you talk about assertive, aggressive, non-assertive, you're limited. But there's a category called empathic assertive.
Okay.
And empathic assertive is being responsive to the other while asserting yourself.
Right, yeah.
So I find that an important concept.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I like that. Empathic assertive. Because the soul, the self, is in fact yearning for love. And we may have unresourceful ways of expressing that. We may act up. We may engage in unresourceful behaviors. Let your mind fill the blanks there in terms of how that might be expressed. But if we have an empathy and we can understand this is the soul yearning for attention, for love, for connection, for yoga, they just don't have the resources. That person doesn't have the resources to express that in helpful ways. And so they end up engaged in destructive activities. And so we can be assertive and but at the same time very compassionate, recognizing there's a soul there just like me.
It's not always easy to do.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's a practice that we cultivate. But if we can see ourselves in the other, it can awaken our compassion. But I agree with you. It's something that we cultivate. And in my case, something that I prayed for a long time as well. Consciously endeavored to develop. And then what happens is life will also throw you a challenge. And then that's also then you can actually find that empathy in your own struggle. It doesn't have to happen like that, but often life will do that. So the self, that distinction between the self and the body, and then there's an idea of samsara, the self cycling through many bodies, through many lifetimes. So long as we remain in material consciousness, with the material attachment and the material conditioning and the material ego, then we just keep getting one body after the other in a cycle of samsara. But then when we start to awaken our spiritual conscious self-awareness, self-realization, and to connect in yoga with the divine and bring a spiritual consciousness to everything that we do, as we discussed, as bhakti yoga, then there's we can end the cycle of rebirth. We can end the cycle of samsara and enter, here's a concept for you, the spiritual world. So we are in the material world, and there is a counterpart, spiritual world. Here everything is temporary. We are conditioned, we identify with temporary bodies that ultimately die. In a spiritual world, everything is conscious, eternal, and blissful. And that's our, according to the Bhakti tradition, that is our actual home. So kind of lost here. Identifying with matter as the self, identifying matter as a source of happiness, and trying to experience happiness through matter. The more things that I have, the more gratification that I have for the senses, the happier I will be. That's the material consciousness or misconception, and as we awaken our self-awareness as a spiritual being and our spiritual consciousness and our spiritual yoga or loving connection with the divine, then there's no need to be born again in another body in the material world, but we can be elevated to the spiritual world. And so this kirtan practice is powerful for awakening that consciousness. So it's off the mat, it's in the workplace, it's in the home, it's in our interactions with others, but then we need to have the practice as well, because it helps us to be out there with that awareness. And so when we gather like this and we engage in the kirtan, it's like a recharge for us, and we kind of we get charged up, and then we go out and we can radiate that spiritual consciousness and share that and be a beacon of that, and even remind ourselves of it. So it's helpful. Having the gatherings, reading the sacred texts as well is another powerful bhakti practice. So it's the kirtan, it's the discussions like we're having, and it's the sangha. So sangha means association. So when we come together with like-minded people like this, it's another recharge, and it's like a booster for our spiritual consciousness. So these are, and then a daily sadhana means in the home having some kind of a regular practice as well, whether it's reading the text or like what we're doing with the kirtan, we can also do with as a personal. I'm trying to find something here in my bag to show you.
Over to your left.
I beg your pardon?
They're just over to your left.
Oh yeah, okay, there we go. Thanks. I knew what I was looking for. So we can also have a personal meditation practice with the mantra as well. And so Jeremy has his hand in the bag there. He didn't injure that hand, but he has his hand in the bag he doesn't have money in there. He has some beads there. This is a mala. And so we chant the mantra, the same mantra that you had on the card. We chant that mala on the we chant that mantra on the beads as well. I'll show you how. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And then we move to the next beat. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. And the next beat. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Guess what happens next?
It's like a prayer beat.
That's right, yeah. So it's, the different spiritual traditions have this. The Buddhists, they have a mala like this also with 108 beads. And then in the Catholic tradition they have 54. 108 to 54 is exactly half, so
Jewish people and Muslims have exactly the same.
Muslims have it too.
Yeah, that's right. So it seems to be a universal practice. And so then you can make a commitment as well. I'll chant one time around the mala every day, or I'll chant 2 times around the mala each day. It'll take like 10 minutes. Or I'll chant 6 times around the mala each day, 8, 16. It helps making a commitment as well in any practice, because then we develop a regular practice. So it's a routine, and it's like you take bath each day to clean the body, then you engage in a meditation practice like this to clean the mind, free the mind, as we were discussing right from the very beginning. So
what is the deal with the bag?
So the bag just helps. It's like a practical thing.
Just to carry it around.
Yeah. So that you don't have the beads just hanging down on the ground. You can just put them in the bag like this, and get yourself a nice asana posture and just meditate and move those beads there. And then we have these little ones on the side. So every time we complete a round, then we pull one of these ones down on the side. So how many do I have here? I have 10 pulled down, but actually I'm on my second round. So that means, so there I have 16 here that I chant each day. So that means, yeah, I'm already 26. My parents, they chant 64 times around a day. They're retired. That's basically what they do. I call home, speak to Dad, I was like, I gotta go back to my chanting.
That must take a long time. How long do you think it takes them to go 64?
64, yeah, so that would take, so 16 takes about 2 hours, an hour and a half. Yeah, so they're spending most of the day just meditating there in Brisbane, Australia. It's nice though. I mean, it's really uplifting. And if you're retired and what else? Yeah. So.
So what happens when you chant this? I mean, are there any things that you're supposed to do or like not do?
Yeah, that's why I said my parents are retired, so
Yeah.
that's.
No, but outside that, like, what if your mind wanders?
Oh, okay. If your mind wanders, yeah. So Krishna says, addresses that in the Bhagavad Gita. He says, he doesn't say if. He says, when your mind wanders, bring it back. It will wander. So he says, when it wanders, bring it back. So, yeah, the mind is an unruly entity. But you'll find that as you engage in the practice, at some point the mind will submit. And
So the chant is always the part of the conscious mind, not subconscious, because it seems like, when you're repeating it becomes part of the subconscious
It
mind,
does.
so it becomes a backburner rather than the foreground. So,
yeah.
so it always remains at the conscious level for you?
No, it can be unconscious. You'll find that, yeah, as you.
So what's in the conscious mind then? What's happening there?
So, yeah, it's a good question. So, you can reach a point whereby pretty much you're in a constant meditation, because you might be doing things and active and engaged in the world, but in the background of your subconscious mind, there'll be a mantra chanting that's going on. And it's always there, like an anchor. And it gives an internal strength and stability and joyfulness, and it's what we were saying, that it's the yoga off the mat, it's the meditation off the mat. You can bring that consciousness to everything you do. So yeah, it sounds like you're speaking from experience.
I mean, this is, I've chanted after a long time, and I was born Hindu, but I was never practicing it,
Right.
never did.
Yeah.
So that's why I thought I'll just connect to, and don't forget my
Right.
roots.
Yeah, but that's exactly what happens. What you're describing is you'll get this. So rather than all the chatter going on, and the labeling and the judging and the, think about it. A day is a day, but then we'll say it's a good day, or it's a bad day, or a horrible day, or a terrible. Who decides that it's a terrible day? It's that mind there that's labeling stuff, and then we feel bad because it's such a terrible day. But we're the ones who decided it. And we're doing that to ourselves all the time. And so rather than just recognizing things and as they are, so to speak, just acknowledging them, we label and judge, and that causes all kinds of anxiety and distress. And so if we give as you so beautifully expressed, if we can internalize a mantra like this and engage the mind that way, then we free ourselves of a lot of distress and a lot of disturbance. And that's just the superficial level, because the more important is the opening and awakening of love and joy. The freedom from suffering and distress, that's actually described in the yoga text as a side benefit. Whereas in the psychology it might be the primary objective. We're going to deal with this. And then the yoga text says, that's just the periphery. That's a side benefit to the practice.
So is this a means to just control your mind, like you mentioned in the beginning?
Well, the controlling of the mind is a means towards an end of getting towards our own spiritual nature, and that yoga with the supreme divine, that spiritual consciousness. Yeah. And the mind, when we can focus and channel it, it's an incredibly powerful force. If we can give direction to it, it becomes a great ally. How are we doing on